Mark Carney tore up the rulebook, leaving the G7 in a deadly silence. No joint statement, no common message. Just one question. If the G7 can't even agree on a single sentence, then is it really still an alliance? When June 2025, Alberta, a place chosen for its isolation and high security, became the scene of the most severe diplomatic shock since the Iran-Iraq crisis, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, expected to play a neutral role, declared that they would drop a G7 statement even before the official summit began. No negotiations, no debates, no agenda bull a unilateral statement. What's more, he made it before Donald Trump even stepped foot in Canada. That left both the White House and U delegations with no time to react. Reuters described it as a deliberate diplomatic void. Japan, Germany, France all caught off guard. The global media could only report on one thing: a summit without a statement, no coordination, no foundation. The G7, once seen as a pillar of stability, now lay in ruins, and when the rituals collapsed, the contradictions were laid bare. Carney didn't just pull out of a statement. He questioned the very legitimacy of the mechanism. From a coordinating center, the G7 summit suddenly turned into a symbol of collective impotence. Many saw this as an impulsive reaction, but I see it as a highly calculated move. Carney, who previously led both the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, isn't someone who acts on impulse. He doesn't need to shout, he simply shuts down the noise. No platform left for Trump to announce tariffs or redraw the world order. Canada, for the first time, asserted its sovereignty not through slogans, but through concrete actions, pulling out of the ritual the US typically used to impose policy dominance, with losses reaching for $2 billion in just the first quarter of the year, due to 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminum. Canada understood this wasn't just diplomacy anymore when Trump demanded NATO increase defense budgets to 5% of GDP, a proposal no G7 member had ever agreed to. It was no longer a suggestion, it was a command. Carney was the first to say no, but he didn't say it. He ripped out the microphone. He didn't oppose in the meeting. He tore down the table itself, and when there was no common script left, each country was forced to face its own raw truth. For nearly half a century, the G7 represented the era of consensus. In the West, democracies cooperating financially, coordinating trade and sharing security. Canada, the smallest by population, often served as the bridge between the US and Europe, smoothing out disagreements. From the 1980s, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney proudly claimed that Canada could talk, privately with both Reagan and Mitterrand. But by 2025, that position had reversed. Canada ran a trade surplus of $38.6 billion with the US, and that very number became the excuse for Washington to impose tariffs. Instead of celebrating success, Trump saw it as exploiting America. And when the foundation of the G7 was twisted by unilateral power calculations, the alliance of values turned into a stage for personal agendas. Canada, once a coordinating center, was now pushed to the margins. The G7 lost its glue, lost its direction. All that remained was the fracture. The principles that once shaped the post-Cold War order were being replaced by pragmatic nationalism. The G7 no longer leads the world. It's learning how to survive amid self-centered egos. Right after his re-election, the Trump administration rolled out a series of policies aimed directly at Canada as a way to reassert global leadership through economic sanctions. Everything got taxed, from milk and softwood to aluminum and high-tech goods. The effects spread from British Columbia to Quebec, $4.2 billion in losses in just Q1. The biggest decline since the global financial crisis. Canada didn't sit still. A high-level economic delegation visited Washington in early March, seeking opportunities to save industries like lithium batteries, renewable energy, and cobalt sectors where Canada is a leader. But what they encountered wasn't negotiation. It was a constitutional shield, the Economic Sovereignty Act. A new law from Trump allowing him to veto any agreement that could affect U.S. economic security trade was no longer a bilateral chess game. It was a unilateral game where U.S. law was global law. Carney understood the game well. He left the table before anyone could make the first move. In this new legal framework, every dialogue became a monologue. Every commitment became a legal loophole. Canada realized just sitting at the table meant agreeing to a rigged game. None of us were prepared for this shock. British Columbia saw 17 sawmills shut down. An estimated 3,000 workers were laid off in just 2 months. Ontario lost a $110 billion contract when the US blocked. Battery exports to Detroit, food prices, especially milk and beef, rose 11.7% in just 90 days. Bloomberg concluded, "This is no longer a supply chain crisis. This is a strategic import recession." The global impact wasn't spared either after the US cancelled 6 bilateral tax exemption agreements and imposed tariffs on $1.30 trillion worth of goods. Major partners like the EU, Japan, and Mexico shifted into defensive mode. Supply chains were shortened, warehouses overflowed, investment was delayed, inflation spiked. In Chicago, many grocery stores had to raise prices 3 times in April. In Lyon and Germany, an electronics factory shut down because it couldn't get semiconductor chips from Canada. And the most worrying part, the people had no one to turn to. Not because there was no government, but because the government was protecting itself from each other. Tariffs and protectionist barriers turned food and essential goods into a new burden for working families. As living costs soared, access to public services like healthcare and education began to collapse in a chain reaction, not just due to lack of money, but because the entire system was drawn into an emergency state. As far as I know, Carney knew well Canada couldn't survive if it continued relying on the US economy, the only solution expanding markets into the EU through the CEDA agreement. And he did just that. New deals were signed with France, Germany, and the UK, covering agricultural products, electric cars, and green technology. The reason wasn't just the market. Europe, especially Germany and France, shares core values with Canada: free trade, environmental commitment, policy, transparency, and adherence to international law. With the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement, Canada needed a partner not just for goods but to help reshape the post-crisis climate order. Europe, with its large market structure and high consensus, was the ideal candidate to rebuild sustainable supply chains and redefine post-G7 trade. The EU swiftly responded by activating its early tariff alert system when Trump threatened to impose a 17% tariff on industrial machinery from Europe. Brussels responded immediately as a united bloc. Japan, not waiting to be attacked, filed a WTO complaint about the US reclassifying aluminum, which could affect $74 billion in export balances. The G7 was no longer a place for strategic planning, but a forum for self-defense. Each country brought its own countermeasures. Canada had retaliation plans. The EU had collective alert systems. Japan chose the legal route. No one expected consensus because no one believed it was still possible. If the G7 model continues to fracture new groups like the G20 and G77, with the presence of many developing countries, may emerge as an alternative. In the near future, global power may shift from alliances of values to alliances of survival, where countries turn to each other not because of consensus, but because they're all being pushed to the edge. But I have a job. My job is to protect the people of Ontario, to protect their jobs, their communities, and their businesses. And car maker Stellantis says as it continues to assess the tariff impact, the company will lay off roughly 900 US employees, at least temporarily, and is pausing production of facilities in Mexico and Canada. They're terrible, they're unfounded, they're inconsistent, they're illogical. There's no logic or plan to it. I think it's awesome. They're shocked, confused. A few people nearly broke into tears talking about it. They're just so disappointed and in some cases really scared about the possibility that this is going to wreak economic pain on both countries. A major shift is brewing in Ontario. Canada is turning its back on the US, leaving 900 American workers without jobs. But the question is there any lifeline left for the American people in a move that's making waves? Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, along with Volkswagen CEO, announced a groundbreaking investment in St. Thomas, Ontario. The deal, a massive $20 billion Canadian dollar investment to build North America's largest electric vehicle battery. Gigafactory Volkswagen is putting up $7 billion, while Canada's federal government is committing $13.2 billion through production credits until 2032. Plus $700 million in direct funding. Ontario's provincial government isn't sitting on the sidelines either, kicking in $500 million in cash and infrastructure support. According to Reuters, this facility is set to produce enough batteries for 1 million vehicles each year and create 3,000 direct jobs. But here's the kicker. No batteries from this factory will be sent to the US. As the project kicks off, Stellantis, the automaker, is already feeling the pinch. They've announced temporary closures of key assembly plants in Windsor, Ontario and Chuca, Mexico, all due to the new tariffs imposed by President Trump. This in turn has led to 900 workers in the US losing their jobs temporarily. When you look at this from a supply chain perspective, it's clear this is more than just a big investment or a bunch of jobs being created. What stands out is that the US has been completely excluded from this new manufacturing setup. As Reuters points out, all of the battery production at Volkswagen's Gigafactory is slated to go to Europe. There's not a single piece of the puzzle involving the US in logistics, technical work, or anything else. This shows a clear shift. Ontario is working on creating a non-Americanized supply chain. At the same time, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney made his first official visit to France and the UK, not Washington. In a speech with President Macron, he called Canada the most European country outside of Europe and emphasized building stronger alliances with more reliable partners. One official accompanying Carney made it clear we're still good friends with the US, but everyone knows what's happening. And from here, it's clear that this is no longer just a trade dispute. This is a strategically planned divorce between two economies that were once tightly interconnected. For the past 3 decades since the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the just-in-time production model has kept North America's auto industry running smoothly. Raw News reports that parts manufactured in Cuco, Indiana, things like powertrains and castings, were sent to Windsor, Canada, and Chuca, Mexico, only to come back to the US for assembly and distribution. But after Trump's administration announced a 25% tariff on imported cars, Stellantis made a move. They preemptively halted production at 2 major assembly plants on April the 7th, even before the tariff officially took effect. This shows just how fragile and vulnerable the system really is. According to Thomas Nett, the fallout from this decision led to 900 workers in the US losing their jobs. In a just-in-time system, stopping production is like shutting off the power. Everything comes to a halt, and now that model, which was once seen as efficient, is in serious danger. According to Reuters and Thomaset, the chain of events started with President Trump's decision at the end of March 2025, when he announced a 25% tariff on all imported cars to the US, including from Canada and Mexico. This move was immediately met with a retaliatory tariff from the Canadian government. On April the 4th, as reported by Rail News, Stellantis announced the closure of its Windsor plant from April the 7th to 21st and the Chuca plant in Mexico until the end of the month. These plants produced key models like the Chrysler Pacifica, Dodge Daytona Jeep Compass, and Wagoneer S. At the same time, according to Thomas Nett, 900 American workers at 5 metal stamping and casting plants, Warren Stamping, Sterling Stamping, Mikuko, Transmission Casting and Indiana plant, had their contracts suspended. Stellantis CEO Antonio Filosa, in an internal email reported by Worrell, wrote, "We didn't make this decision lightly, but it is necessary to adapt to the current market." The statement from the president of the Unifor Canada Union, according to Rael, Trump is about to realize how interconnected the North American manufacturing system is, and the workers will be the first to pay the price. The impact isn't just limited to job losses. According to Rael, 4,500 workers at the Windsor plant and 2,400 at Tuca lost direct income, but deeper still is the shift in investment trends. While Stellantis cuts back, according to Reuters, Volkswagen is building its largest plant in Canada, funded by both the federal government and the Ontario provincial government. According to The Guardian, the Mark Carney government is shifting its strategic focus, halting plans to buy US F-35s, reviewing all defense cooperation. Meanwhile, projects in batteries, clean energy, and new manufacturing infrastructure are all pointing towards Europe, bypassing the US. The long-term consequences are not just labor risks. Canada is increasingly shaping itself post-US with its own battery supply chain, separate markets, its own standards, and most importantly, its own political alliance. If this trend continues, in my view, the economic and geopolitical order of North America is entering a quietly transformative phase, but one that's irreversible. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't choose Washington for his first overseas trip. He chose Paris and London, the two capitals that shaped Canada. In Paris, he spoke in both languages. Canada is the Europe, bypassing the US. The long-term consequences are not just most European country among non-European nations. Standing next to President Macron, he didn't mention Trump by name, but his message was clear: Canada will choose reliable allies. Macron responded, "Canada is a special friend. Fair trade is more effective than tariffs." In London, he was welcomed at Buckingham Palace by King Charles, followed by Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who called Canada a shared sovereignty ally with a shared king and shared values. This wasn't just ceremonial, it was a political declaration. On his way back, Carney stopped in the Arctic to reaffirm sovereignty at a time when the US was edging closer to Russia and even hinting at annexing Canada as the 51st state. In Ottawa, his government is revisiting the F-35 purchase, halting the purchase of military gear from the US. We once thought if trade was threatened, partners would react. But by 2025, Canada isn't reacting. It's proactively pulling away. The Gigafactory is being built not to serve the US Prime Minister. Carney didn't go to Washington because he doesn't need to. The question is no longer who's right in the tariff war, but how many other allies are silently preparing to leave without us realizing.